The days that followed were a blur of recovery. Mikhail remained in the village, his strength gradually returning as the warmth of the fires and the kindness of the people gave him a renewed sense of hope. The woman who had found him, known simply as Baba Katya, had taken him in as if he were one of her own, nursing him back to health with her simple remedies and wisdom born of years surviving the harsh Siberian winters. The village was small, nestled in a valley at the edge of a frozen river. The villagers lived modestly, hunting and fishing for their food, their homes built from sturdy wood to withstand the brutal cold. Despite the biting wind and endless snow, the people were warm-hearted, welcoming Mikhail without question. They knew the wilderness could take anyone, no matter their origin or status, and in Siberia, survival was shared. As Mikhail regained his strength, he spent time helping the villagers with their daily tasks, chopping wood, mending fishing nets, and learning the ways of the land. But every moment, his thoughts remained fixed on Yelena. She was his guiding star, the reason he had come this far, and though the warmth of the village was comforting, he knew he couldn't stay. His journey was not yet complete. One evening, as the fire crackled in Baba Katya's small home, Mikhail asked her about the lands that lay beyond the village. She looked at him for a long moment, her weathered face thoughtful. "The land ahead is not easy," she said softly, stirring the stew she was cooking. "You'll have to cross the frozen rivers and the desert of ice beyond that. Few dare to make the journey alone." Mikhail's heart tightened at her words. He knew the dangers, but the thought of Yelena waiting for him in the palace on the snowy peak kept him resolute. He thanked Baba Katya for her hospitality and told her he must continue. The older woman nodded, understanding without protest. "The frozen rivers can be treacherous," Baba Katya warned him, "but if you keep moving and don't linger, you may cross safely. As for the desert, it is vast and endless. The winds will tear at your soul, and the cold will try to take you. But remember your reason for surviving, and you may endure." Mikhail listened carefully, her words echoing the warnings that had already echoed in his heart. He would have to face these dangers head-on, just as he had survived the forest and the mountains. The following morning, after gathering what little supplies he could from the villagers, a thick fur coat, a small sack of dried meat, and a flask of water, Mikhail bid them farewell. Baba Katya hugged him tightly, pressing a small silver pendant into his hand, her eyes filled with warmth and concern. "This is for protection," she whispered. "May it guide you through the cold." With that, Mikhail set out once more, his heart filled with determination and love. The village grew smaller behind him as he walked along the banks of the frozen river, the vast wilderness opening before him once again. The wind had returned, sharp and unforgiving, but Mikhail kept his head low, his eyes on the path ahead. The frozen river stretched out like a mirror beneath a pale sky, its surface covered in a layer of snow that crunched beneath Mikhail's boots. The ice groaned under the weight of his steps, a deep, hollow sound that sent shivers down his spine. He could see cracks in the ice, thin and jagged, spreading out like veins beneath the snow. Each step had to be calculated and deliberate. The cold was brutal, wrapping around him like a vice, but Mikhail kept moving, his pace steady and unyielding. He knew if he stopped for too long, the cold would take him, and he would become just another soul lost to the wilderness. As he crossed the river, the wind picked up, howling across the ice and whipping snow into the air. Mikhail squinted against the gusts, pulling his fur coat tight around him. He could feel the ice shifting beneath his feet, the cracks growing louder with every step. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Baba Katya's words echoed in his mind, "Keep moving. Don't linger." Hours passed, and the river seemed endless, the banks barely visible through the swirling snow. The cold was relentless, seeping into his bones, but Mikhail pushed forward, his mind focused solely on the thought of Yelena. She was waiting for him, her heart aching just as his was. He couldn't fail her now. Just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of blue and purple, Mikhail reached the far bank of the river. His legs ached, his body trembling from the effort, but relief washed over him as he stepped onto solid ground once more. He had made it across the frozen river, but his journey was far from over. Ahead of him stretched the desert of ice that Baba Katya had spoken of. It was a vast, barren expanse of snow and ice, the ground flat and featureless, disappearing into the horizon. The wind here was fierce, howling across the frozen wasteland like a beast hunting its prey. There were no trees, no rocks, no landmarks to guide him, just an endless sea of white. Mikhail took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the horizon. The desert was intimidating, but he had come too far to turn back now. He pulled his fur coat tighter and took his first step into the frozen desert, the wind tearing at his face, the snow swirling around him like a storm. The desert was unlike anything Mikhail had ever experienced. The cold was sharper, more biting than before, and the wind never ceased, its howls echoing in his ears. The snow beneath his feet shifted and crunched, but there was no rhythm to the landscape. Every step felt as though he was walking on the edge of the world, the horizon always just out of reach. But through it all, he kept moving. His thoughts were with Yelena, her face the beacon that guided him through the storm. He imagined her waiting for him at the palace, her heart beating in time with his, her love as strong as the winds that battered him from every direction. Night fell quickly in the desert, the temperature dropping even lower than before. Mikhail could feel the exhaustion creeping into his bones, but he refused to stop. The darkness was suffocating, the wind howling louder, but he pressed on, his feet moving of their own accord. He could feel the weight of the cold pressing down on him, threatening to take him, but he clung to his memories of Yelena, her love keeping him alive. As the hours passed, Mikhail's body began to falter. The desert seemed endless, the wind tearing at his soul, but just as he began to lose hope, a faint light appeared in the distance. It was small, barely visible through the swirling snow, but it was there, a flicker of warmth in the frozen wilderness. With the last of his strength, Mikhail staggered toward the light, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind fought him, the cold gnawed at his bones, but he kept going. The light grew brighter, closer, until finally he saw the small cabin nestled against the icy dunes. Mikhail collapsed at the door, his body trembling, his breath ragged. He had survived the frozen desert. But the hardest part of his journey was still ahead. Inside the cabin, warmth flooded over him as he collapsed onto the floor. A lone figure stood over him, offering shelter for the night. Mikhail's body ached, but his spirit was alive. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around Mikhail like a long-forgotten embrace. His body was trembling uncontrollably, and his vision blurred as he collapsed onto the wooden floor. For a moment, he couldn't tell if the warmth was real or just a cruel hallucination brought on by the unrelenting cold. But as his eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, he realized this sanctuary was no illusion. The cabin was small, its walls lined with shelves of dried herbs and furs. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, the flames dancing with life, casting flickering shadows on the rough wooden walls. Standing by the fire was an older man, his face worn with years of surviving the harsh Siberian wilderness, his hair and beard as white as the snow outside. The man approached, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and pity as he looked down at Mikhail, who lay shaking on the floor. Without a word, the man lifted Mikhail into a chair by the fire, draping thick furs over his frozen limbs. He handed him a steaming cup of broth, the warmth of it seeping into Mikhail's bones. Mikhail's hands shook as he brought the cup to his lips, the hot liquid reviving him, bringing life back into his frozen body. For hours, Mikhail sat in silence, absorbing the heat from the fire, his body still recovering from the brutal journey across the frozen desert. The older man didn't ask questions, didn't pry into the past or future. He seemed to understand that Mikhail was a man driven by something deep and powerful, and that words weren't necessary. In the quiet of the cabin, the fire spoke for them, its warmth a temporary shield against the unforgiving world outside. As the hours passed, Mikhail's strength began to return. He sat up straighter, feeling the life slowly return to his limbs. The older man watched him carefully, nodding approvingly as Mikhail found his footing again. It was then, with a voice as rough as the wind that howled outside, that the man spoke. "You've come far," he said simply, his voice a gravelly whisper. "But the hardest part is still ahead." Mikhail nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire. He knew what the man meant. Beyond the desert, past the frozen rivers and forests, lay the final obstacle, the mountain. The towering, snow-covered peak where the king's palace stood, where Yelena waited for him. The journey so far had pushed Mikhail to the brink, but he had known from the beginning that the final ascent would be the greatest test of all. The older man, sensing the weight of Mikhail's determination, handed him a thick walking staff carved from sturdy wood. "This will help," he said, his voice low. "The mountain is unforgiving. You need every bit of strength you have left." Mikhail took the staff, gripping it tightly, the solid weight of it grounding him in the moment. He looked up at the older man, gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you," Mikhail whispered, his voice hoarse from days of cold and exhaustion. The man nodded once more, then turned back to the fire, his presence a silent, reassuring strength. The next morning, Mikhail stepped out of the cabin, the biting wind greeting him once more. But this time, the cold didn't seem as cruel. His body was still weary, but his mind was clear, and his heart was resolute. He had survived the frozen wilderness, the rivers, the desert, and now only the mountain stood between him and Yelena. The mountain loomed before him, its peak lost in swirling clouds of snow. The path was steep, jagged, and treacherous, but Mikhail's heart surged with purpose. Each step he took was one step closer to the woman he loved, the woman whose face had kept him alive through the worst of Siberia's trials. He gripped the walking staff tightly, using it to steady himself as he began the final ascent. The climb was slow, the snow and ice making every step a battle against the elements. The wind was fierce, howling through the narrow passages of the mountain, threatening to knock Mikhail off balance. His legs burned with the effort, his hands numb despite the thick gloves he wore. But he pressed on, his mind focused on the peak above where Yelena waited. As he climbed higher, the air grew thinner and the cold more biting. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one a reminder of how far he had come and how much further he still had to go. The path became steeper, the snow deeper, but Mikhail refused to stop. He could feel the weight of his journey in every muscle, every bone, but his love for Yelena was stronger than the pain. Hours passed, and the landscape became more treacherous. The cliffs rose around him like frozen giants, their faces sheer and unforgiving. The snow swirled in great gusts, obscuring his vision, making it difficult to see the path ahead. But Mikhail kept going, using the staff to pull himself up over the jagged rocks, his body trembling with exhaustion but his heart filled with determination. Just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Mikhail reached a small plateau near the top of the mountain. He paused for a moment, his chest heaving with effort, his hands gripping the staff so tightly that his knuckles were white. The palace was close now. He could see its towering walls in the distance, their golden spires barely visible through the swirling snow. But as he stood there, catching his breath, the ground beneath him began to shift. A low rumble echoed through the mountains, and Mikhail's heart leapt into his throat. The snow and ice that had clung to the cliffs above began to break free, sliding down toward him with terrifying speed. An avalanche! Mikhail's mind raced as he watched the wall of snow and ice crash down the mountain, heading straight for him. There was no time to think, no time to plan. He turned and ran, his legs burning with the effort, the sound of the avalanche roaring in his ears. The ground shook beneath him, and the wind howled around him, but Mikhail kept running, his heart pounding in his chest. The avalanche was closing in, the snow crashing down the mountain like a white tidal wave. Mikhail's body screamed for rest, his legs buckling beneath him, but he refused to stop. He could feel the snow at his heels, the cold biting at his back, but he pushed forward, his mind focused on one thing: survival. With one final burst of energy, Mikhail threw himself behind a large boulder, pressing his back against the cold stone as the avalanche roared past him. The snow and ice thundered down the mountain, shaking the ground beneath him, but Mikhail held on, his heart racing. When the avalanche finally subsided, Mikhail lay there for a moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. He had survived. Somehow, he had survived. He stood, his legs shaky, his heart pounding in his chest. The path ahead was covered in snow, but the palace was still visible, its golden spires gleaming in the last light of the setting sun. He was close, so close. With the last of his strength, Mikhail began the final stretch of his journey, the palace looming before him like a beacon of hope. The cold was fierce, the wind unrelenting, but nothing could stop him now. Yelena was waiting. As Mikhail reached the gates of the palace, his heart pounded with a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. The journey had tested every ounce of his strength, pushing him beyond what he thought possible. Yet here he was, standing at the gates of the palace, his body trembling from the cold but his spirit alive with hope. Yelena was so close he could almost feel her warmth in the frigid air. The palace loomed above him, an imposing fortress of ice and stone. The golden spires glittered against the twilight sky, reflecting the last remnants of sunlight as the snow continued to fall around him. But the beauty of the palace was cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth that Mikhail carried in his heart. He knew that the true beauty lay within those walls. Yelena, the woman who had captured his soul, the woman he had fought through ice and snow to return to. He staggered forward, his legs barely holding him up, as he approached the palace gate. The guards stationed there didn't recognize him at first, their expressions skeptical as they looked at the disheveled figure before them. But Mikhail's eyes burned with such intensity, such determination, that they hesitated. "I've come for Yelena," Mikhail said, his voice hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. The guards exchanged glances, their faces conflicted. They had been told of Mikhail's exile, of the punishment that had been intended for him in the frozen lands of Siberia. No one was meant to return from such a sentence. Yet here he was, alive, standing before them. And in his eyes, they saw something that made them pause, a love so fierce that not even the king's orders could extinguish it. Without a word, one of the guards nodded, and the gate creaked open. Mikhail stumbled through, his heart racing as he crossed the threshold into the palace grounds. The air inside was warmer, the cold replaced by the soft glow of lanterns and the faint sound of music drifting from the grand halls. But Mikhail barely noticed any of it. His entire focus was on Yelena. He moved through the palace with purpose, his legs shaking but his heart guiding him. Servants and nobles turned their heads in surprise as he passed, whispers following him like a shadow. But none of it mattered. Only she mattered. As Mikhail ascended the grand staircase that led to the royal chambers, his pulse quickened. Each step brought him closer to her, to the woman he had crossed mountains, rivers, and deserts for. He could hear his breath, ragged and shallow, echoing in the silent halls, but his determination never wavered. And then, finally, he saw her. Yelena stood at the window of her chamber, her eyes gazing out at the snow-covered mountains beyond the palace. Her silhouette was illuminated by the soft glow of the lanterns, her figure framed by the falling snow outside. She seemed ethereal, a vision of beauty and grace that had haunted his dreams for so long. But now she was real. She was here. "Yelena," Mikhail whispered, his voice breaking. She turned at the sound of his voice, her eyes widening in shock as they locked onto his. For a moment, neither of them moved, the world around them falling into stillness as they stared at each other. Mikhail could see the disbelief in her eyes, the overwhelming emotion that filled her heart as she realized what she was seeing. He had returned. He was alive. With a cry of joy, Yelena rushed across the room, her arms outstretched as she threw herself into Mikhail's embrace. The force of her love nearly knocked him off balance, but he held her tightly, his arms wrapping around her as if he would never let go again. She buried her face in his chest, her sobs of relief and happiness echoing in the chamber as Mikhail held her close, his heart beating in time with hers. "You came back," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I thought I'd lost you forever." "I would have crossed the ends of the earth to find you," Mikhail replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing could keep me from you. Not the cold, not the king, not even death." They stood there, locked in each other's arms, as the weight of the world seemed to fall away. Mikhail could feel the warmth of Yelena's love radiating through him, melting the cold that had seeped into his bones during his journey. He had fought so hard to reach this moment, and now that it was here, it felt as if time itself had stopped, allowing them to exist in this perfect, eternal embrace. But their reunion did not go unnoticed. From the shadows, the king stepped forward, his face a mixture of shock, anger, and something else, admiration. He had believed Mikhail would never survive the harsh sentence he had imposed. He had expected the cold of Siberia to do what his power could not. Yet here Mikhail stood, a living testament to the strength of his love for Yelena. The king's eyes narrowed as he regarded the man who had defied him, who had risked everything to return to his daughter. Mikhail, sensing the king's presence, pulled back slightly from Yelena, turning to face him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the tension in the air thick as snow. But the king, for all his power, could not deny what was in front of him. He had seen many things in his lifetime: wars fought, kingdoms built and destroyed, but he had never seen a love like this. A love so powerful that it had conquered the most unforgiving forces of nature. With a heavy sigh, the king nodded, a reluctant but undeniable respect in his eyes. "You have earned your place here," the king said quietly, his voice filled with an unexpected sense of surrender. "If my daughter's love for you is as strong as yours is for her, then who am I to stand in its way?" Mikhail and Yelena exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling with relief and joy. They had won. Against all odds, against the forces of nature and the will of a king, their love had triumphed. In that moment, everything fell into place. Mikhail had faced death, battled the unforgiving elements, and emerged victorious. And now, standing in the warmth of the palace with Yelena in his arms, he knew that no force on earth could ever break the bond they shared. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside the palace, there was only warmth born of a love that had conquered all. And as Mikhail and Yelena held each other, surrounded by the glow of the firelight, they knew that their story would live on, whispered in the halls of the palace, told in the village squares, and passed down through generations. It was a story of love that had defied the harshest trials. A love that had survived the coldest winters and the darkest nights. A love that had triumphed against all odds. This story of Mikhail and Yelena would be remembered for generations, a testament to the enduring power of love. A love that no cold, no distance, no command could ever extinguish.